let me dive right into it, because indeed you haven't had the chance to read the paper just yet. And I basically have to say up front that I agreed as well with our dear organizers that I will, try to limit the input that I'm going to give you to a good 20-25 minutes so that you get a chance to ask specific questions. That means that I, obviously cannot go into the whole, depth of the paper itself, but hopefully it'll be enough to, provide some food for conversation and for discussion. So, I want to say it again. This is, as I'm presenting you the outline of the presentation, it's been a real pleasure working with IPPI already and Boll. And we are very grateful that we've been given the opportunity to join your series of workshops and speak to a topic that is indeed dear to our hearts, and also something that Ecologic Institute has been working on a variety of, from a variety of angles with a whole team of colleagues for a couple of years now. There are a number of aspects of climate policy governance that we've been analyzing, be it individual instruments such as these national energy and climate plans that all EU member states have had to develop, or long-term strategies, or that EU climate law that was already referenced. And one of the things that Nick and I focused on is analyzing climate laws, national climate laws. And so what I'm presenting today and what the paper is on, and this is, obviously the version that is in the ecologic layout, but it'll be, much nicer looking when IPPI is done with it, is drawing strongly on a report that we published earlier this year that was funded by the European Climate Foundation, that was, building on previous work and analyzing the state of affairs, basically from about a year ago. And what we've been able to do now in the paper is update and expand that work and, present you a new way of accessing that information. So, I want to start out with who is already using climate framework laws and why. And, I'm starting a little bit smaller, starting with the European Union, where, our current state of knowledge has it that indeed there's now a majority of EU member states that already has a climate law or is actively in preparation or considering its introduction. And I have to say, I'm speaking about the majority of EU member states, but there are several other European countries that are also on the map here and have been given a color code other than gray, showing you that they also have a climate law. So that goes for Switzerland, for example, for Norway and for Iceland. So, actually the group is larger and is obviously now, also enlarging to the east, if our map tool had been able to fit that all properly on one page. So as Oz said, what we've been analyzing are the laws specifically that look at a long-term perspective. And that's, in line with what your minister, the Israeli minister, also said, that we're here for looking for sustained action. And Barbara Seimetz, talked about the long distance race. So that's also been our focus here, looking at the laws that specifically include that long-term perspective. Now, I'm broadening it from the European map. I'm not looking at another map, but looking at the, first there's the EU law already mentioned, but OECD countries. We've already heard that more than 90% of them employ some form of carbon pricing, but also a good 2/3 of them already have a climate framework law, or again are in preparation or have it under consideration. And I should say that the list of I think a good 10 countries that don't have such overarching framework legislation just yet. That at least in the United States and Australia, there are such frameworks that have been put into law at the subnational level. So California, we'll hear more about actually in a later presentation, which is why I wanted to include the reference here already. And then there is also the provinces of Victoria and New South Wales in Australia. So even where at the federal level, there isn't a consensus yet on the introduction of such frameworks in law, it is already happening at the state level below. And then, of course, very important to reference that there is a long list of non-OECD countries that also have such climate framework laws. And for different motivations, and some with a different focus, some maybe with a stronger emphasis on adaptation rather than mitigation. But a number of them, such as the law in the Philippines, have been around for several years now and have already been revised. So, I don't mean to, by focusing on the countries that are closest to us and analyzing those, not give the wrong impression that this is, a phenomenon that is limited to a certain set of countries, but is actually, I think, a bit of a global trend. And we can certainly see that the adoption of the Paris Agreement, with its clear long-term outlook, and the agreement on the need to have a transformative approach to climate policy has driven the adoption and the consideration of adopting such framework laws. So, that actually is a bit of a segue as to why our country is adopting this. And again, I think I want to, reference the analogy that and the differences at the same time that the minister used in talking about the pandemic and our existing current immediate crisis and the climate crisis, because I think we've seen from the way that governments and societies are struggling with the current crisis that effective crisis management is essential, and that's true also for climate policy. And since we need sustained action here, we have a very, somewhat different outlook. The climate crisis isn't something immediate for everybody. That means they shouldn't be, leaving the house or putting on a mask. But actually, action is required now, but it's towards an objective that is, much further in the future, and that may not seem to impact everyone as immediately. So these are additional challenges for politicians in particular to be interested in making investments in these types of policies. And so, it means that, there aren't immediate benefits to politicians taking on action that is about targets that are, 20, 30 years in the future. So, these governance frameworks can help create a connection between the now and the future, and create processes and procedures that last beyond an individual electoral cycle. And government policy should be able to do that, but our systems often struggle with stable governance, and so having these additional frameworks can create some stability. And we are also facing a problem that isn't just limited to a certain sector, but actually needs a whole economy approach. And again, that's something that not a lot of governmental action is always well equipped to deal with. So there's a need for coordination and collaboration between governments. And again, this is where setting up a dedicated framework can really help. So while all of that is about, why do you need to set up a governance system, give yourself processes and set up responsibilities, but, why do that in the form of a law? And, I'm not saying it's not possible to do it in the form of the law, to be that very clear. It may be that there are, political cultures and administrations that can work well and stick to what they've promised without putting in a law. But clearly, it's the strongest statement that a government can make to say, we're giving ourselves new structures and setting objectives, and we're putting them in the form of a law. And that's an important signal, not just to all of the governmental agencies that then need to take action and follow suit, but also to all of the external stakeholders. citizens as well as businesses. And investments, and we do need significant investments also in new types of technologies and modes of operation to tackle climate change. Investments need predictability and confidence that the politicians aren't going to change the system and the goals every other year, or with every change in ruling coalition. And so this is what a law can help provide, that confidence and that stability. It's certainly harder to go back on promises, even with a new government coming in. We all know the example of the Affordable Health Care Act in the United States, and the strong focus that the Republicans had on tearing it down when they got the presidency 4 years ago. And at the same time, they haven't been able to actually tear it down and replace it with a new system. So something that's already in place, that's in legal form, has a certain momentum and strength of its own. And these processes that are being put in place, they can create also overall greater transparency and about who is responsible, but also where we are in terms of how well we're doing towards targets. And so if you take all these things together, one of the things that the law can really provide you is a sense of a higher chance of success that you're actually achieving the goals that you're setting out. So, and that is also means confidence in political actions and goals, not just being, statements of intent. What is absolutely crucial, of course, that it is nevertheless true that, of course, laws can be changed, and we do want for that possibility to exist. Democratic will gets expressed on a regular basis. We want new governments to be able to, set a new direction for policies. They should have and they must have the opportunity to change legislation. So the law in and by itself isn't going to guarantee that you have a system that's going to last the next 20, 30 years. And so what we've found is actually interestingly that in almost all of the laws that we analyzed, there's broad political support for the concept of establishing such a framework and putting it in law. And I've thrown into the slide here the example of Denmark. Denmark had a law already adopted in 2014. Last summer, not last summer, when I say last summer, I mean the summer of 2019, they had an election and a minority government taking office, more progressive than the last one on climate. And they wanted to adopt new targets. And but they were worried that a new government, a couple of years down the line, might take them down again. And so what they actually did was sit down with all of the opposition parties that were interested and reached a deal about almost exactly, I think, to the day 1 year ago. It was on the 6th or the 7th or the December, a deal on, it says there in the tweet, doesn't it? 6th of December 2019. This is the Danish environment or climate minister. He says, we have an agreement, climate law, because they basically got the opposition to sit down and agree with them on core pillars for a revision of their existing climate law, which has provided a significant strengthening. So, this goes to show it is absolutely possible to, create political support. And there are many other examples. In Sweden, for example, there was a commission, multi-party commission that was looking into examples of climate laws and what the benefits would be for Sweden. And there are many more like that. Obviously, there are other driving forces like public support through citizens being clearly in favor, showing their voice through protest. That was an additional factor in Germany, for example. Anyway, what this goes to show, and we see that, most interestingly, anecdotally, I think from the UK example, if you have that broad political support, your system can withstand the shocks of other crises, political crises, because it was literally a week after the Brexit referendum that the UK, just went through with the implementation and adopted a new future carbon budget under the implementation of its Climate Act. And so, this is an anecdotal example, but nevertheless, these systems, if they have that kind of support, they can be more resilient. On to the contents, the core elements. I have to admit, I'm going to check with Paulina and Oz. Do you have a rough indication on where I am time-wise? This is probably at like the 10, 11, 12-minute mark.
So I took a bit longer than I should have. So I would say that if you want, you can speak another, I would say 10, 15 minutes even.
Okay, well,
I don't see that there are too many questions, so maybe the Q&A session will be a bit shorter, but you can go on.
Excellent, thank you. So I just wanted to know. So I'll aim for 10. And so, this is, first of all, so we have looked in other work already trying to figure out, what are the core elements of these governance systems and specifically climate framework laws. And, there isn't one way of clustering or grouping the things that are included. What we've done here is to try and take what we've seen in our analysis and try to put it in a framework. And so, we've come up with these like 5, I think, key questions that we think that a lot of governance systems have to answer, and that a lot of them do. And so we use that also as a means of presenting the information. The first one of these is, what are we actually wanting to achieve? What are the targets that we're setting ourselves for climate policy? Those, should be, clear and laid out. Then there is the obvious, follow-up question. So, what can we do to achieve them? And here we've included both strategic planning, mapping out over longer time periods. What are the options? What needs to change in the economy in individual sectors? And what a lot of countries use there are long-term climate strategies. But then this also needs to be broken down into individual policies. For the near term, what are we doing? What are the policies for the next 5 or 10 years, for example? So that's both under, how do we get to those targets? And then, if you're, on your way, you want to be sure that you're actually making progress. And so the key, next question is, how well are we doing? So this is, monitoring progress, checking on what change is actually being affected by the policies. And that information can then, help complete the policy cycle. If familiar with that notion, that information and other, say, scientific input can help you either revise or set new targets. It can also help inform, making changes to your policies, etc. And then, the key question for any government is, so who is actually making a contribution, who is doing what in that overall setup, and it allows you to allocate responsibilities. And then, who else outside of government is being involved? And here we have, both, we've differentiated that in, scientific advice and public participation opportunities. What we have now, what we've done is we've analyzed 10 countries. The Hungarian one is the latest one. It's an addition to also our previous report. Sadly, it wasn't, all that substantive. And there are a couple of countries where we've been updating information. So, Spain is the one law here in the list that hasn't actually adopted its law, but it's pending. A draft was submitted to Parliament at the end of May of this year. The Danish amendment, that the change in the law that I referenced earlier, was actually adopted in August, and we've updated here as well. And other countries are, some are reviewing their existing legislation. So Finland, for example, needs to change its current law, which is outdated because they're setting themselves much more ambitious policy. But those are the 10 countries that have gone into our analysis. They all have in common that they have a long-term perspective enshrined one way or another. And I don't have time to now run through all of the elements in detail and give you all of the good practices. But I can give you a flavor of what that is and what's in the paper, maybe with the first or the first two. So, that's going with the targets. Nearly all of the laws, build on concrete emission reduction targets. You would have expected that, I know. But there are, the odd exceptions. Sweden, for example, I'll show you the example again later, has a very short law. The target was not written into the law, but they have a target setting process through Parliament included. Ireland, for some somewhat bizarre reason, has a more qualitative description about what they want to achieve. A transition to a low carbon economy, but it doesn't say, this specifically is our target. But in general, the rule is quantitative targets, and they're directly enshrined in legal text. There are also interim targets, or there are processes for setting interim targets. And 3 countries already, and Ireland may be the next one after its upcoming amendment, are using a concept called carbon budgets in various ways that specifically sets for certain periods maximum allowable volumes of emissions. So, we have, this is an example of the types of information that we've distilled from that and the good practice examples. You can tell from the country mentions here, there isn't one law that includes all of the ideal versions, and that's not ideal elements. And we've tried actually not to suggest that there is an ideal way of doing a law. I think this is one of the key insights. They share these elements, or a lot of these elements, but they all put their own national context and their own national flavors on it, and come with their own specific innovations to make it fit for purpose in the country and in the political context. So I'm gonna rush through the stuff that is otherwise in the paper, and I will just give you the brief summary, which is that there are a couple of things that basically really all those laws show. And interestingly, except for the Hungarian law, all of the 9 others have set up an independent scientific advisory to support climate policy making. In the Swedish case, it's not directly in the law, but it is there. It was set up as part of the same overall framework. And they have both an information provision function, so they're giving information to government to make better policy, but they also have a watchdog function in most cases, meaning there's an independent third-party review of governmental action and progress, which enhances accountability. There is also a good level of transparency in almost all of the laws, meaning annual progress reports that are made public, that are in addition to what countries have to send to the UN anyway. They do need to send their GHG data, their greenhouse gas emissions, but they, creating an annual opportunity, say a report that is sent to Parliament, for example, showing governmental progress, creates an opportunity for public discussion, for media attention, for naming and shaming, or for praise, where it's due. So that's there in almost all of them. A lot of them also have a mechanism to respond to a lack of progress, which is basically, if you in the cycle earlier, it's basically making sure that the data you're actually gathering is having an impact on your, and again informs policymaking. And the targets I talked about specifically. Where there is less detail is on the intragovernmental coordination. There are a couple of laws in Finland, in Germany, and Nick, you will have to give me the third one or fourth. I don't know it off the top of my head right now. That have specifically dedicated articles and have instilled new coordination mechanisms. A number of others do not do that. And some countries like Spain or France, they have like these super or uber ministries that really have a lot of relevant portfolios. They're called, such things as ecological transition ministries. So they combine a lot of the sectors and can do policies for a wider part of the economy. But in other countries, that's not the case. So then public participation, a key component, and actually not referenced almost everywhere, but dedicated mechanisms in just a few countries. And that is interesting considering that a number of countries are experimenting with citizen assemblies as a means of involving the public. And the strategic planning component, which is something we've analyzed in other work, very closely, is also not that strongly ingrained included in a number of the laws, which I think, carries a certain risk that your near-term policy isn't informed by how you're planning to get to your long-term target. I have two more things. Do I have time for two more things or not?
Yes, I would say, Matthias, that we give you 5 more minutes for the presentation, and then there are 2 questions, okay. So we also have time to okay.
I have not been able to monitor the chat in parallel, so I haven't seen the questions just yet, and I'm sorry if I could have addressed them in between, but maybe we'll get it all.
No, it's fine. We can address them as part of the Q&A.
Excellent. Okay, so Paulina asked me specifically to very briefly speak to Germany. And of course, it's a pleasure to be talking about the home country. You may have seen it in the list earlier, the adoption was also a year ago, December 2019, of the German climate law. And I have to say, at the start of that year, 2019, when the German government that had just come into office after a struggle of finding a government coalition, was having a hard time defining its new climate policy. I would never have thought that we would be getting a national climate framework law at the time. So the notion had been around for a decade or plus, with Social Democrats and the Greens being very much in favor, but the Conservatives, Chancellor Merkel's party, not being in favor. But, on the one hand, there are 2 key things that made it happen. Is there was increasing evidence from the data that we were missing our climate targets for 2020 in particular, far off. The big climate pioneers and champions with their climate chancellor, Angela Merkel, missing the targets, big embarrassment. So there's a growing recognition that something needed to be done. We needed to have a stricter handle on what, in particular, transport and the building sector and agriculture were contributing, because energy was doing okay, with the renewable energy deployment that we've been able to get done. And there was public protest. Fridays for Future was out in force, and that helped create, I think, in combination, an atmosphere that also got us, as part of a larger package of instruments, got us this framework law. So I've tried to indicate a little bit, on the key elements, how good that law is, or what's included, what's not. I don't need to go into all of that detail, but you get a sense that in terms of the elements that we were analyzing earlier, it actually has most of them in some form or another. This is not a qualitative assessment. It's basically just descriptively ticking the box. The targets are there. The long-term climate plan. There was even an article that was originally in a draft and deleted. That's a bit of an odd gap, but there were some really interesting innovations. And the one that I want to pick out on is that this carbon budget approach that Germany has taken is basically giving every sector, main emitting sector of the economy, and a carbon budget, and has figures in an annex for every year. So for transport, for 2021, there is a maximum allowable emission figure in the law, the same for buildings, etc. And the ministries that have those portfolios, they are essentially responsible for making sure that those numbers are being met. And if the data monitoring shows that they are off, then there is a trigger that additional policies must be adopted. So very specifically, the law tried to address the embarrassment of us not meeting our targets. That was the specifics on Germany. And I have like one more thing, because the laws are so different despite the common elements. Some of them are, amending 10 other pieces of legislation and are 50 pages long. The French one has all kinds of detail on other specific policies, for example. But I have two here that are basically a page long, from Sweden and from Hungary. And so, I wanted to show that it is possible to also do this in a short way, but you need to watch out, because here's the analysis against the main elements. So in the Swedish law, I mentioned them for what they were missing. The target, it's not directly written into the law, but there's a process, and the target was adopted the same day by Parliament alongside the climate law. They also don't have the independent council included, but they created one side by side. So you may not count that entirely. But if you compare it with the Hungarian law, which basically only mentions the targets and then has a lot of general intent on, taking action and recalling certain principles, but doesn't establish any procedures. I would say this is in terms of the challenge that governments have to create effective climate policy, that example of the Hungarian climate law is not providing the guidance and the governance procedures that are needed. So, in terms of climate governance, that's essentially a bit of an empty shell. And, you don't want to adopt a climate law just for the sake of being able to say, we have a national climate framework law. So that's, I'll leave it there. Brevity is not a problem as such, but, there's got to be some substance in it.